The autumn festival was in full swing when I walked up to David and Chloe's table at Rosewood Bistro, the sounds of live music and children's laughter drifting through the open windows. My husband looked up with that familiar mixture of surprise and annoyance, while she, the woman who had been texting him for months calling him Daddy, simply smiled and said, "Hello, Rachel. I've been waiting to meet you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." I placed the manila envelope on the white tablecloth between them, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I think it's time we talked about Tyler and Zoe's real father." The color drained from David's face as he realized what I'd discovered, but Chloe just nodded knowingly. "I told you she'd figure it out eventually, Daddy." The first text arrived on a Tuesday morning in September while I was packing Tyler's lunch for school. David's phone buzzed against the granite countertop, and I glanced over automatically as I always did when we were rushing through our morning routine. The message preview made me pause, sandwich halfway to the lunchbox. "Morning, Daddy. Can't wait to see you later. Miss you already." I stared at the screen for a moment, trying to process what I'd just read. The sender was listed as C with a heart emoji. David emerged from upstairs, adjusting his tie as he grabbed his coffee mug from the machine. "Your phone," I said, gesturing toward the counter. "Someone called you Daddy." David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second before his usual morning smile returned. "Probably a wrong number," he said, scooping up the device without looking at it. "You know how these spam texts are getting weirder?" Something about his dismissive tone bothered me, but Tyler was already calling from the living room that he couldn't find his backpack, and Zoe was asking for help braiding her hair. The moment dissolved into the chaos of getting 2 children ready for school, and David off to his job at Sterling Financial Group. But the unease lingered. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more messages arriving at odd hours. David had always been protective of his phone, but now he seemed almost paranoid about it, taking it with him to the bathroom, keeping it face down during dinner, charging it on his side of the bed instead of the kitchen dock we'd always used. When I asked about it casually, he explained that Sterling was implementing new security protocols for client communications. "Financial advisors are prime targets for hackers," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "We have to be extra careful about our devices now." It made sense. David managed investment portfolios for some of Millbrook's wealthiest families, including the mayor and several prominent business owners. Privacy and security were paramount in his field. I pushed down the suspicious voice in my head and focused on more immediate concerns, like Tyler's upcoming parent-teacher conference and Zoe's request to take piano lessons. The voice became harder to ignore when David started working late more frequently. Sterling Financial had always demanded long hours, especially during quarterly reporting periods, but this felt different. He'd call around 6 to say he'd be home by 8, then text at 8:30 that a client meeting was running over, then finally arrive home after 10, with apologies and takeout from whatever restaurant was still open. "The Peterson account is requiring a complete portfolio restructuring," he explained one night as he sat at our kitchen table with Thai food containers spread before him. "Mrs. Peterson wants to diversify into sustainable investments, which means researching entirely new fund families." I watched him eat his pad thai mechanically, scrolling through emails on his phone between bites. The man I'd married 10 years ago used to put his device away during meals, even quick late-night ones like this. We'd talk about our days, laugh about something funny Tyler had said, or marvel at one of Zoe's latest artistic creations. Now conversation felt like an interruption to his digital multitasking. "Maybe you should hire an associate," I suggested. "You're burning yourself out." "Can't afford it yet," he replied without looking up. "Need to build the client base more first." The irony wasn't lost on me. David's income had grown substantially over the past 2 years, allowing us to renovate the kitchen and take the kids to Disney World last summer. Yet somehow there was never enough for additional help, even as the workload seemed to consume more of his time and attention. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early October. David was in the shower, and his phone sat on the nightstand charging. I'd gotten up early to start laundry before Tyler's soccer game, but as I passed through our bedroom, the device lit up with an incoming call. The name on the screen read Chloe, with a photo of a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes. I stared at the phone, frozen. This wasn't a client calling on a weekend morning. This was personal. Intimate, even. Given the professional headshot-style photo David had apparently assigned to her contact information, the call went to voicemail, but immediately another text appeared from the same number. "Answer your phone, Daddy. We need to talk about what happened last night." My hands shook as I read the message. Last night, David had supposedly been at a client dinner with the Hendersons, discussing their retirement planning. He'd come home after 11, claiming the restaurant had been slow with service. And Mr. Henderson was a meticulous questioner who wanted to understand every aspect of his portfolio allocation. The shower was still running. I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, and opened David's text thread with Chloe. What I found there made me sink onto the edge of our bed, clutch our Egyptian cotton duvet, and question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The messages went back months, hundreds of them. Photos, videos, intimate conversations, planning secret meetings. But it wasn't just an affair. The language they used was disturbing, inappropriate in ways that made my skin crawl. She consistently called him daddy, in contexts that were clearly sexual, and he not only encouraged it but seemed to initiate many of their exchanges with paternal language that felt deeply wrong. "Good girl, you did exactly what Daddy wanted. Daddy's proud of how you handled that situation. You know Daddy takes care of his special girl." I scrolled through weeks of messages, each one more disturbing than the last. This wasn't role-playing between consenting adults. The dynamic felt genuinely psychological, rooted in something darker and more complicated than a simple extramarital affair. But it was one particular conversation from 3 weeks earlier that made me physically nauseous. "Chloe, sometimes I wonder what would happen if Rachel found out about us." "David, she won't. And even if she did, she could never understand what we have. You're Daddy's girl in ways she could never be." "Chloe, I know. It's different with us. It always has been. Ever since I was little. Ever since she was little." I read that line over and over, each repetition making the implications clearer and more horrifying. This relationship had history. Long history. And the power dynamic between them wasn't just sexual roleplay. It was rooted in something that had begun when Chloe was a child. The shower shut off upstairs. I quickly closed David's phone and placed it back on the nightstand, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. I needed more information before confronting him. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. That afternoon, while David took Tyler to soccer practice and Zoe was at her friend Madison's house for a play date, I created a fake social media profile and searched for Chloe Rivers. Her Facebook page was relatively private, but her Instagram was public, with hundreds of photos chronicling her life as a real estate agent in nearby Hartford. I scrolled through her posts methodically, looking for any connection to David or our family. Most of her content was professional. Staged photos of million-dollar homes, inspirational quotes about achieving your dreams, snapshots from real estate conferences and networking events. But interspersed among the business posts were personal photos that gradually painted a disturbing picture. Photos of expensive jewelry with captions like, "Daddy spoils me." Pictures from upscale restaurants with "dinner with my favorite person" and a heart emoji. Luxury handbags, designer clothes, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard and the Hamptons, all tagged with references to her special someone who preferred to stay out of photos. But it was a post from Father's Day that stopped me cold. A photo of an expensive watch with the caption, "Happy Father's Day to the man who's been taking care of me since I was 12. You've always been more than enough. Love you, Daddy." Since she was 12. I screenshot the post and continued digging through her timeline, going back years. The pattern became clearer the further I went. References to Daddy appeared consistently, dating back to when she was in high school. Photos from graduations, birthdays, holidays, always with mentions of someone special who was helping her, supporting her, being there for her in ways that seemed parental but felt inappropriate given the context I now understood. I found her LinkedIn profile next. 29 years old, graduated from University of Connecticut, worked for Prestige Properties in Hartford. But her employment history showed gaps that coincided with some of the luxury trips documented on Instagram. Periods where she wasn't working but was clearly living comfortably, traveling extensively, shopping at high-end stores. The pieces were forming a picture I desperately didn't want to see. David had been financially supporting this woman for years, possibly decades. The client dinners and late meetings were cover for their relationship. The new security protocols at work were excuses to hide their communication. And based on her own social media admissions, this had been going on since she was a child. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching David's past, looking for connections I'd somehow missed over 10 years of marriage. We'd met when I was 24 and he was 28, both of us young professionals navigating the dating scene in Hartford. He'd been charming, successful, seemingly honest about his history. He mentioned an ex-girlfriend from high school, but described it as ancient history, nothing serious. Now I wondered if Chloe was that high school girlfriend. If she'd been underage when their relationship began. If the financial discrepancies I'd noticed in our accounts over the years, money David claimed was invested in market opportunities or used for client entertainment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Had actually been funding her lifestyle. When David returned home with Tyler, grass-stained and hungry after soccer practice, I watched him carefully for signs of deception. He moved through our kitchen with the same casual confidence he'd always had, reheating leftover pizza for lunch, asking about my plans for the afternoon, discussing whether we should take the kids to the pumpkin patch next weekend. He seemed genuinely relaxed, unburdened by guilt or anxiety. Either he was a sociopathic manipulator who felt no remorse about his double life, or he'd become so comfortable with his lies that maintaining them required no conscious effort. "You're quiet today," he observed, settling onto the couch next to me while Tyler played video games in the basement. "Everything okay?" I looked into his brown eyes, searching for some indication that he was hiding something monumental from me. But David had always been difficult to read. It was one of the qualities that made him successful in financial advising. Clients trusted him because he seemed steady, unflappable, conservative in his emotional responses. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well last night." "Maybe we should plan a weekend away soon," he suggested, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "The kids could stay with your parents. We could drive up to Vermont, see the foliage, stay at that bed and breakfast you liked." His suggestion felt genuine, loving even, but knowing what I now knew about his secret communications with Chloe, I couldn't help wondering if he was simultaneously planning romantic getaways with both of us. The thought made me feel sick. That evening, after Tyler and Zoe were asleep, I made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of our marriage. Instead of confronting David directly with what I'd discovered, I decided to investigate further. I needed to understand the full scope of his relationship with Chloe before deciding how to respond. I started by creating a timeline of David's absences over the past year, cross-referencing his claimed work obligations with his actual whereabouts when possible. I checked our credit card statements for charges at restaurants, hotels, or stores that didn't match his stated activities. I examined our bank accounts for unexplained withdrawals or transfers. What I found was a pattern of deception that stretched back years. Regular cash withdrawals that David claimed were for client lunches or business networking events. Credit card charges at expensive stores on days when he was supposedly working late. Hotel bills from nights when he said he was attending conferences or meeting with out-of-town clients. The financial impact was staggering. Over the past 3 years, David had spent approximately $60,000 on activities and purchases that he'd hidden from me. Money that should have gone toward Tyler and Zoe's college funds, our retirement savings, or family vacations, had instead been funding his secret relationship. But the financial betrayal, as devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the psychological implications of what I'd discovered. The language in his texts with Chloe suggested a relationship dynamic that had been established when she was underage. If that was true, David wasn't just an unfaithful husband. He was potentially a predator who had groomed and exploited a vulnerable child. I needed more information about their history together. I needed to understand exactly when their relationship had begun and under what circumstances. Most importantly, I needed to determine whether my own children were at risk. The thought that Tyler and Zoe might be in danger from their own father was almost too horrifying to contemplate. But I couldn't ignore the possibility. If David had inappropriate relationships with underage girls, my children were potentially vulnerable in ways I'd never considered. I started paying closer attention to David's interactions with Tyler and Zoe, looking for any signs of inappropriate behavior or boundary violations. I observed how he spoke to them, touched them, responded to their questions and requests. I watched for any indications that he treated them differently than other parents treated their children. What I found was more complicated than I'd expected. David was genuinely affectionate with both kids, but his parenting style had always been somewhat formal and distant. He attended their school events and helped with homework when asked, but he didn't engage in the spontaneous roughhousing or silly conversations that characterized my own interactions with them. I'd always attributed this to personality differences. David was naturally reserved, professional in most of his relationships. I was more emotionally expressive, quicker to laugh and play, and show physical affection. Our different styles seemed to complement each other, providing the children with both structure and warmth. Now I wondered if David's emotional distance from Tyler and Zoe was protective rather than temperamental. If he maintained boundaries with his own children because he understood his own potential for inappropriate behavior. The thought was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. 3 weeks into my investigation, I made contact with Linda Walsh, a divorce attorney recommended by my friend Karen, who had gone through her own messy separation 2 years earlier. I wasn't ready to file for divorce. I still hoped there might be some explanation for David's behavior that didn't involve the worst-case scenarios I was imagining, but I wanted to understand my legal options. Linda's office was located in a renovated Victorian house in downtown Millbrook, decorated with antique furniture and family photos that created an atmosphere of warmth and professionalism. Linda herself was probably 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of marital dysfunction. "Tell me what's brought you here, Rachel," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat in one of 2 leather chairs positioned in front of her desk. I handed her printed copies of the most disturbing text messages between David and Chloe, along with financial records showing his hidden expenditures and a timeline of his suspicious activities. Linda read through everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "How long have you been married?" she asked, without looking up from the documents. 10 years. We have 2 children together. Tyler is 12 and Zoe is 8. And this relationship with Chloe, do you have any evidence about when it began? I showed her the social media posts I'd screenshot, particularly the Father's Day tribute mentioning their connection since Chloe was 12. Linda's expression grew more serious as she reviewed the evidence. "Rachel, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Have you ever noticed any inappropriate behavior from your husband toward your children or other minors?" The question I'd been dreading hung in the air between us. I told her about my observations over the past few weeks, David's formal parenting style, my concerns about potential grooming behavior. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been watching him closely, and I haven't seen anything that seems inappropriate with Tyler and Zoe. But now I'm second-guessing everything. Maybe I missed signs. Maybe I didn't want to see them." Linda nodded sympathetically. "It's natural to question your own judgment when you discover that someone close to you has been living a double life. But based on what you've shown me, I think we need to consider the possibility that this relationship with Chloe began when she was underage." She explained the legal implications of what I'd discovered. If David had indeed groomed and maintained an inappropriate relationship with Chloe since childhood, he could be facing criminal charges that would affect not just our marriage, but our entire family's future. The custody implications alone were staggering. "My recommendation is that you continue gathering evidence, but also consider involving law enforcement," Linda said. "If there's been criminal behavior, particularly involving a minor, that needs to be addressed regardless of what you decide about your marriage." I left Linda's office with a business card for Detective Frank Rodriguez, who specialized in cases involving exploitation of minors. I also had a plan for getting more concrete evidence about David and Chloe's relationship history. The next step would be meeting Chloe herself. I had been avoiding direct contact with her, partially because I wasn't sure how to approach the situation, and partially because I was afraid of what I might learn. But Linda was right. I needed more information before making any major decisions about my family's future. I spent several days planning how to approach Chloe. I couldn't simply call her and explain that I'd discovered her relationship with my husband. That would give her and David opportunity to coordinate their stories or destroy evidence. But I needed to create a situation where I could observe their dynamic firsthand and potentially get her to reveal information about their history. The opportunity presented itself when I learned that Chloe would be attending Millbrook's annual Autumn Harvest Festival as a vendor representing prestige properties. The festival was held every October in the town square, featuring local businesses, food trucks, live music, and activities for children. David and I had attended together every year since moving to Millbrook, and this year would be no exception. I suggested to David that we make an afternoon of it, bringing Tyler and Zoe for the games and live entertainment. He agreed enthusiastically, mentioning that it would be good to show community involvement given his growing client base in town. What he didn't know was that I'd already confirmed Chloe would be working the Prestige Properties booth from noon until 6, and I'd made dinner reservations at Rosewood Bistro for that evening under her name, claiming to be her assistant and explaining that she'd be bringing a client to discuss a potential property listing. The festival was perfect autumn weather, crisp and sunny with the maple trees surrounding the town square displaying brilliant red and gold foliage. Tyler and Zoe ran ahead of us toward the carnival games while David and I strolled between the vendor booths, sampling apple cider and admiring handmade crafts from local artisans. I spotted Chloe before David noticed her. She was exactly what I'd expected from her social media photos. Petite, auburn-haired, with the kind of careful makeup and styling that suggested significant time and money invested in her appearance. She wore a burgundy dress that was professional but fitted, with expensive-looking jewelry that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Let's look at the real estate booth," I suggested casually. "I'm curious about property values in the neighborhood." David's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His stride faltered slightly, and I felt his hand tense where it rested on my lower back. He recovered quickly, but I'd caught the moment of panic. "Real estate's boring," he said. "Let's find the kids and get them some kettle corn." But I was already walking toward Chloe's booth, forcing him to follow or create a scene. She looked up as we approached, and the expression that crossed her face confirmed everything I'd suspected. Recognition, followed by surprise, then a quick glance at David, before she composed herself into a professional smile. "Good afternoon," she said brightly. "Are you folks looking for information about properties in the area?" "Actually," I replied, studying her face carefully, "I was hoping to learn more about local market trends. My husband David works in financial planning, so we're always interested in real estate as an investment opportunity." The way she looked at David when I said his name was everything I needed to confirm their relationship. Not the polite interest of a stranger being introduced to a potential client, but the complex mixture of affection, nervousness, and something that looked almost like fear. "David Chen," he said, extending his hand for what was clearly a performance of meeting her for the first time. "Sterling Financial Group. Chloe Rivers, Prestige Properties." She shook his hand, and I watched their eyes meet for just a moment longer than would be appropriate between strangers. I spent the next 10 minutes asking detailed questions about property values, mortgage rates, and market predictions, all while observing the subtle interactions between David and Chloe. The way she glanced at him when she thought I wasn't looking. The careful distance he maintained, standing slightly behind me, rather than beside me, as he usually did when we talked to new people. Most telling was how Tyler and Zoe reacted when they eventually found us at the booth. Tyler barely looked at Chloe, but Zoe studied her with the intense curiosity 8-year-olds reserve for adults they find interesting or unusual. "You're really pretty," Zoe announced with her typical lack of filter. "Do you know my dad?" The question hung in the air for a moment that felt like an eternity. Chloe's eyes went wide, and David quickly put his hand on Zoe's shoulder. "Ms. Rivers is a real estate agent, sweetheart. She helps people buy and sell houses. Oh, Zoe said, apparently satisfied with this explanation. But she continued staring at Chloe with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. We left the booth a few minutes later, David claiming he wanted to catch the bluegrass band performing on the main stage. But I could feel his tension as we walked away, and I noticed him checking his phone more frequently than usual for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, I told David the first had a headache and needed to stay home with the kids while he went to dinner with a college friend who was supposedly visiting from Boston. He seemed relieved by this excuse to go out alone, which confirmed my suspicion that he planned to meet Chloe. I arranged for our neighbor Mrs. Patterson to watch Tyler and Zoe, claiming I had to run a quick errand. Then I drove to Rosewood Bistro, arriving just as David and Chloe were being seated at a corner table that would have provided privacy for an intimate conversation. I watched from the parking lot for several minutes, gathering my courage for what I was about to do. Through the restaurant's windows, I could see them talking intently, their body language suggesting this was far from a casual encounter. David reached across the table at one point and touched Chloe's hand, a gesture that was unmistakably romantic. This was it. The moment when I would finally confront them both and demand the truth about their relationship. I had no idea what I would learn or how it would change my family's future, but I couldn't continue living with the uncertainty and deception. I walked into Rosewood Bistro with the manila envelope containing printed copies of their text messages, financial records, and social media evidence tucked under my arm. The hostess greeted me with a smile, but I barely heard her as I made my way directly to their table. David looked up first, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally resignation as he realized what was happening. Chloe turned in her chair, and when our eyes met, she didn't look surprised at all. "Hello, Rachel," she said calmly. "I've been waiting to meet you." I pulled out the empty chair at their table and sat down, placing the envelope on the white tablecloth between us. The restaurant continued buzzing with conversation around us, other diners unaware that a 10-year marriage was about to implode. "I think," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "it's time we talked about Tyler and Zoe's real father." David's face went completely white as he stared at the envelope, while Chloe leaned back in her chair with what looked almost like relief. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds before David found his voice. "Rachel, what are you doing here? You said you had a headache." "I lied," I replied simply. "Just like you've been lying to me for God knows how long." I opened the envelope and spread the printed text messages across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Several other diners glanced our way, but I no longer cared about maintaining appearances or protecting David's reputation. "Explain these," I said, pointing to the most damning exchanges. "Explain why your ex-girlfriend has been calling you daddy since she was 12 years old." Chloe spoke before David could respond. "Because he is my daddy, Rachel. In every way that matters." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected their relationship had inappropriate origins, but hearing Chloe confirm it so matter-of-factly was still shocking. "That's enough," David said sharply, but Chloe continued as if he hadn't spoken. "My biological father left when I was 10. My mother was working 2 jobs just to keep our apartment. David lived next door with his parents during high school. He started helping us out, giving my mom money for groceries, driving me to school when she couldn't. He became the father figure I never had." I studied her face as she spoke, looking for signs of manipulation or coaching, but her tone was sincere, almost offensive. "When did it become sexual?" I asked bluntly. David started to protest, but Chloe held up a hand to stop him. "When I turned 18 and graduated high school. David was in college by then, but he came back for my graduation. That's when everything changed between us." 18, I repeated. "You're sure about that?" "Of course, I'm sure. It was my 18th birthday. David took me to dinner to celebrate, and afterward we went back to his parents' house. They were out of town visiting his grandmother. That's when I told him how I really felt about him. The relief I felt was overwhelming. 18 was legal. Inappropriate given their history, but not criminal. Not the predatory grooming situation I'd feared. but David's expression suggested there was more to the story. "Tell her the rest," he said quietly to Chloe. "What rest?" I asked. Chloe looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd sat down. David tried to stop it. He said our age difference was too big, that people wouldn't understand our relationship. He said he'd always think of me as a kid, even though I was legally an adult. So what happened? I convinced him that I wasn't a kid anymore, that I knew what I wanted and who I wanted it with. I told him I'd been waiting for him since I was 16. Since she was 16. The number sent a chill through me, even though nothing illegal had happened. "And you believed her?" I asked David. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his response to stress. She was very mature for her age. Her mother had basically abandoned her emotionally, and I was the only stable adult in her life. When she said she loved me, really loved me, not just as a father figure but as a man, I wanted to believe it was real. "It was real," Chloe interjected. "It is real. David, you know how I feel about you." I looked between them, trying to understand the dynamics at play. "So you started a relationship when she was 18. Why the daddy dynamic? Why the secrecy?" "Because that's what she wanted," David said. "She said calling me daddy felt natural, that it acknowledged our history together. I thought it was just role play, something that would fade as she got older and more independent. But it didn't fade, I observed. No, it got stronger. Chloe became more dependent on me financially, emotionally, psychologically. She'd call me crying if I didn't respond to her texts immediately. She'd show up at my apartment unannounced if I tried to create space between us. She said I was the only person who understood her, the only one who really loved her. I was beginning to see a different picture than the one I'd initially imagined. Not a predatory older man manipulating a vulnerable girl, but a young woman who had developed an unhealthy attachment to her father figure and refused to let him go. "When did you meet Rachel?" Chloe asked David, her voice tight with what sounded like jealousy. 2 years after we started dating. I was trying to build a normal relationship with someone my own age. I thought if I found someone else, someone appropriate, I could transition Chloe into a healthier dynamic. "But you didn't break up with her," I said. "I tried, multiple times. But every time I attempted to end things, she'd threaten to hurt herself. She'd call me in the middle of the night saying she'd taken pills or was standing on a bridge. I'd rush over and find her in crisis, completely dependent on me for emotional stability." Chloe was staring at her hands, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I wasn't manipulating you, David. I really was falling apart when you tried to leave me. You were all I had." "So you kept both relationships going," I said to David. "Me and her, simultaneously. At first, I thought I could gradually reduce my involvement with Chloe while building something real with you. But the more serious we became, the more desperate she became. When I told her I was planning to propose to you, she had a complete breakdown. Ended up hospitalized for 3 days. "Hospitalized for what?" "Suicide attempt," Chloe said quietly. "Pills and alcohol." I really thought David was going to abandon me completely. The pieces were falling into place, but not in the way I'd expected. This wasn't a simple case of infidelity. It was a complex psychological situation involving emotional manipulation, codependency, and what appeared to be genuine mental health issues. "So you married Rachel but continued supporting Chloe," I said to David. "I didn't know what else to do. Her mother had died by then and she had no other family. No close friends. I was literally the only person in her life. I thought if I could help her get established professionally, maybe she'd develop other relationships and become less dependent on me. But that didn't happen either. Every time she seemed to be making progress, something would go wrong. She'd lose a job, or a potential boyfriend would reject her, and she'd spiral back into crisis mode. And always, it was my fault for not being available enough, for choosing my wife and children over her." "Your children," Chloe said, her voice becoming bitter. "Tyler and Zoe, who get to have you as their father every day while I only get stolen moments and secret phone calls. They're my biological children, Chloe." "That's different." "Is it?" she asked, looking directly at me. "Because I've been wondering about that for a while now." The restaurant seemed to grow quieter around us. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I processed what Chloe had just implied. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "David and I were still together when Tyler was conceived," Chloe said. "And when Zoe was conceived. In fact, we were together more often than David was with you during both of those periods." I turned to David, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for anything that would contradict what Chloe was suggesting. Instead, I saw guilt and something that looked like resignation. "David," I said slowly, "are Tyler and Zoe your biological children?" The pause before he answered told me everything I needed to know. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've never had them tested." The world seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself as the implications of his admission crashed over me. "You don't know," I repeated. "You've been raising 2 children for 12 and 8 years respectively, and you don't know if they're genetically yours." "The timing was close," he said defensively. "You and I were trying to conceive, but we were also having relationship issues. I was spending more time with Chloe during those periods because things at home were tense." "What kind of relationship issues?" I demanded. "You wanted me to choose between you and her. You said I was too involved in helping an ex-girlfriend, that it was inappropriate for a married man to be financially supporting another woman. We fought about it constantly. I did remember those fights, though I'd forgotten how intense they'd become. In the early years of our marriage, David had been sending money regularly to someone he claimed was a former colleague who'd fallen on hard times. When I'd pressed for details, he'd become defensive and accused me of being jealous and controlling. "So during our fights, you'd go to Chloe for comfort," I said. "It wasn't like that. She needed me. Her apartment building was being sold, and she couldn't afford to move. She was between jobs and couldn't get references because her previous boss had tried to assault her. I was the only person she could turn to. And you slept with her during this time. We were both adults, Rachel. You and I weren't even sharing a bedroom during some of those periods. You'd told me you needed space to figure out whether our marriage was going to work." The memory of those difficult early years came flooding back. We'd rushed into marriage after only dating for 6 months, and the reality of living together had revealed fundamental differences in our approaches to relationships, money, and family obligations. I had indeed asked for space during several crisis periods, sleeping in the guest room while we attended couples counseling. "But you never told me you were still sleeping with your ex during our separations," I said, "because I knew it would end our marriage. And I thought once we worked through our issues, my relationship with Chloe would naturally fade into the background. Except it didn't. Because every time I tried to establish boundaries with her, she'd create some new crisis that required my intervention. And by the time Tyler was born, I couldn't risk a paternity test because if he wasn't mine biologically, I'd still want to be his father. The legal and emotional complications seemed overwhelming." I stared at David, trying to reconcile the man I'd thought I married with the person sitting across from me. He'd built our entire family on uncertainty, never knowing whether the children he was raising were genetically his but afraid to find out the truth. "What about Zoe?" I asked. "Same situation. By the time she was conceived, you and I were supposedly working through our problems, but there were still periods where we weren't intimate. And Chloe was going through another crisis with her career and housing situation. So you were sleeping with both of us during the conception windows for both children." Yes. The simple admission hung between us like a bomb that had finally detonated. Everything I'd believed about my family, my marriage, my children's origins was potentially false. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked Chloe. "Because I'm tired of living in secret. I'm tired of being the other woman in my own relationship. David has been my partner for 11 years, longer than he's been with you. I've supported his career, helped him through difficult clients, been there for him in ways you never have." "Supported his career how?" I introduced him to most of his biggest clients. Real estate and financial planning go hand in hand. Half of his portfolio came through referrals from my contacts in the luxury home market. This was news to me. David had always claimed his client base grew through professional networking and word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied customers. "David, is that true?" He nodded reluctantly. "Chloe knows everyone in the high-end real estate market. Her clients are exactly the demographic that needs comprehensive financial planning. When she recommended my services, people listened. So she's been not just your secret girlfriend, but also an unofficial business partner. More than unofficial, Chloe said. I should have been getting commission on those referrals, but David said it would be too complicated to explain to you why he was paying money to his ex-girlfriend. I was beginning to understand the full scope of the deception. David hadn't just been hiding an affair. He'd been hiding an entire parallel relationship that encompassed emotional intimacy, financial interdependence, and professional collaboration. What do you want from me? I asked Chloe directly. I want David to stop living a lie. I want him to acknowledge our relationship publicly. I want to know whether Tyler and Zoe are his children or mine. Yours? Biologically his, emotionally mine. I've been part of their lives since they were born, Rachel. Do you think all those business trips and client emergencies were real? David brought me to Tyler's first steps. Zoe's first words. I've been to more of their school events than you realize. The revelation hit me like another physical blow. You've been secretly attending my children's school events? Not secretly. I just stayed in the background. But yes, I've been there for their important moments because David wanted me there. Because he considers me part of his family. I looked at David, searching for denial, but found none. You brought her to our children's milestones without telling me? You would have tried to stop me. And Chloe was right. She'd been part of our lives from the beginning. It felt wrong to exclude her from Tyler and Zoe's important moments. It felt wrong to exclude your secret girlfriend from family events, but it felt right to lie to your wife about it? I was trying to balance everyone's needs. You wanted a traditional nuclear family. Chloe needed to feel included and valued. I thought I could manage both relationships without anyone getting hurt. Except everyone got hurt, I said. I've been living a lie for 10 years. Chloe's been relegated to secret status despite what she considers a primary relationship. And Tyler and Zoe have been raised by a father who doesn't even know if they're genetically his children. The weight of the situation was becoming overwhelming. I'd come to the restaurant expecting to confront a simple affair, but instead I'd discovered a complex web of relationships, dependencies, and uncertainties that challenged everything I thought I knew about my family. What happens now? I asked. David and Chloe looked at each other, and I realized they'd probably discussed this moment many times over the years. That depends on you, Chloe said. David's been waiting for you to figure out the truth so he wouldn't have to be the one to destroy your illusions. My illusions? The perfect marriage, the biological children, the faithful husband. David's been protecting you from reality because he thought you couldn't handle it. I stood up from the table, needing distance to process what I'd learned. The restaurant had grown busier during our conversation, but I felt completely isolated from the normal world around us. I need to think about this, I said. All of it. The paternity questions, the business relationship, the years of deception. Rachel, David said, starting to rise from his chair. No, don't follow me. Don't call me tonight. Don't try to explain or apologize or manage my reaction. I need space to figure out what's real and what's not. I left the restaurant without looking back, walking to my car in the crisp October evening air. As I drove home to Tyler and Zoe, I realized that everything I'd thought I was fighting to save, my marriage, my family, my sense of reality, had been an illusion for years. The question now was whether the truth, however complicated and painful, was better than the comfortable lies I'd been living with. When I arrived home, Mrs. Patterson was helping the children with homework at the kitchen table. Tyler was working on a math worksheet while Zoe practiced writing her spelling words in careful cursive letters. How did your errand go? Mrs. Patterson asked as she gathered her things to leave. Enlightening, I said, which was certainly true if inadequate. After she left, I sat with Tyler and Zoe as they finished their homework, studying their faces for resemblances to David that I'd never questioned before. Tyler had David's dark hair and serious expression, but his eyes were lighter, more like my own. Zoe's features were a blend that could have come from either of us, with David's stubborn chin but my freckles. Looking at them now, knowing what I knew about the uncertainties surrounding their conception, I realized that genetics had never been what made David their father. He'd been there for late-night feedings and diaper changes, school pickup and bedtime stories, soccer practices and piano recitals. Biology was just one component of parenthood, and perhaps not the most important one. But the deception was a different matter entirely. David had built our family on lies, allowing me to believe in a version of our life that wasn't complete or accurate. He'd made decisions about paternity testing, about Chloe's involvement in our children's lives, about the nature of our marriage, without including me in those choices. "Mom," Zoe said, looking up from her spelling words, "is Dad coming home tonight?" "I'm not sure, sweetheart. He's at a business dinner that might run late." "He's been having a lot of business dinners lately," Tyler observed. "Yes, he has. Are you and Dad getting divorced like Madison's parents?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you've been acting weird around each other. And Dad sleeps in the guest room sometimes now." I hadn't realized the children had noticed the growing tension between David and me over the past few months. I'd thought we'd been hiding our problems successfully. "Marriages go through difficult periods sometimes," I said carefully. "Your father and I are working through some issues." "What kind of issues?" Zoe asked. "Adult issues. Nothing for you to worry about." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. The issues David and I were facing would ultimately affect Tyler and Zoe profoundly, regardless of how we tried to shield them from the details. After putting the children to bed, I sat in our living room trying to process everything I'd learned. The house felt different now, like a stage set for a play I'd been unknowingly performing in for years. Every family photo on the mantel, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every memory we'd made in this space was colored by the knowledge that David's attention and loyalty had been divided the entire time. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Can we talk when I get home?" I turned off the phone without responding. I wasn't ready for his explanations or apologies. I needed time to think through my options and decide what kind of future I wanted for myself and my children. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now in a similar position to the one Chloe had been in for years. Uncertain about my place in David's life, unsure whether I was the primary relationship or the secondary one. The difference was that I had legal protections as his wife and the mother of his children, but those protections felt hollow given the deceptions that underlay our entire marriage. I considered calling my sister or my best friend Karen, but I wasn't ready to explain the situation to anyone else. The complexity of what I'd discovered, the paternity questions, the business relationships, the years of parallel lives, felt too overwhelming to summarize in a phone conversation. Instead, I made a list of questions that needed answers. Were Tyler and Zoe biologically David's children? Did it matter legally or emotionally? What financial obligations did David have to Chloe? And how had those affected our family's financial security? What was the true nature of their business relationship? And had David been violating any professional ethics guidelines? How long had Chloe been attending our children's events? And what did Tyler and Zoe know about her presence in their lives? What did David want for the future? Continued secrecy, public acknowledgement of his relationship with Chloe, or an end to their involvement entirely? Most importantly, what did I want? Did I want to fight for a marriage that had been built on deception from the beginning? Did I want to learn the truth about my children's paternity? Or was I better off not knowing? Could I accept David's relationship with Chloe as part of our family dynamic? Or was that too much to ask of anyone? By the time David's car pulled into the driveway around midnight, I'd reached one conclusion. I needed more information before making any permanent decisions. Tomorrow, I would call Detective Rodriguez and Linda Walsh to understand my legal options. I would also schedule appointments for paternity testing, regardless of how painful the results might be. I heard David's footsteps on the stairs, hesitating outside our bedroom door before continuing to the guest room. For tonight, at least, we would maintain the physical distance that had become symbolic of the emotional distance between us. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of deciding whether our marriage could survive the truth, or whether the lies had been too fundamental to overcome. The sound of David moving around in the guest room reminded me that I wasn't the only one whose life had been irrevocably changed by tonight's revelations. He'd been living with these secrets for years, managing the stress of maintaining two relationships while protecting everyone involved from painful truths. But my sympathy for his situation was tempered by anger at his choices, He could have ended his relationship with Chloe before marrying me. He could have insisted on paternity testing when Tyler and Zoe were born. He could have been honest about Chloe's role in his business success and her attendance at our children's events. Instead, he'd chosen deception at every turn, constructing an elaborate facade that protected him from having to make difficult choices while leaving everyone else to live with incomplete information. As I finally fell asleep in our king-sized bed that suddenly felt enormous and empty, I realized that regardless of what I decided about our marriage, I would never again be the woman who trusted blindly in appearances and comfortable assumptions. The truth, however painful and complicated, would be better than living another day in someone else's carefully constructed illusion. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The sleepless night had given me time to process the emotional shock, and now I was ready to approach the situation methodically. David had already left for work by the time I got Tyler and Zoe ready for school, which was probably for the best. I needed space to think and plan without his presence clouding my judgment. After dropping the children off at Millbrook Elementary, I drove directly to Detective Rodriguez's office. Linda Walsh had given me his card, but I hadn't expected to need it so soon. The police station was a modern brick building that tried to look welcoming but still felt intimidating as I walked through the glass doors. Detective Rodriguez was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with graying temples and kind eyes that suggested he'd handled these types of sensitive situations before. His office was small but organized, with family photos on his desk and certificates on the walls. "Mrs. Harper," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Linda Walsh mentioned you might be calling. What can I do for you?" I explained the situation carefully, focusing on the facts rather than the emotions. The text messages, the financial discrepancies, the relationship that had begun when Chloe was 18 but had roots going back to when she was 12. Detective Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow pad. "Based on what you're telling me," he said when I finished, "this doesn't appear to be a criminal matter. The relationship began when Ms. Rivers was legally an adult, and while the power dynamic is concerning, that alone isn't illegal. What about the financial aspect? David's been hiding money from our joint accounts to support her lifestyle. That could be relevant in divorce proceedings, but it's not criminal fraud unless he was stealing money that wasn't his to give. As your husband, he has legal access to your joint accounts, even if you disagree with how he spends the money." I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that David wasn't a criminal predator, disappointment that the legal system couldn't provide a clear resolution to my situation. However, Detective Rodriguez continued, "There are some aspects of what you've described that concern me. The psychological manipulation, the threats of self-harm when he tried to end the relationship, the financial dependency that's been maintained for over a decade. These suggest a pattern of coercive control that could be relevant if Ms. Rivers ever decides to file charges or seek help." Charges against David? Potentially. Psychological abuse and financial coercion can be criminal offenses under certain circumstances. But the victim would have to cooperate with an investigation, and from what you've told me, Ms. Rivers sees herself as being in a consensual relationship. I left the police station with more questions than answers, but also with Detective Rodriguez's assurance that he would keep my information on file in case the situation escalated. He also gave me contact information for a social worker who specialized in complex family dynamics and psychological manipulation. My next stop was the medical clinic where Linda Walsh had recommended I arrange for paternity testing. The process was simpler than I'd expected. Cheek swabs that could be done at home and mailed to a laboratory for analysis. Results would be available within a week. The nurse who explained the procedure was professionally discreet, but I could see curiosity in her eyes. Paternity testing wasn't uncommon, but requesting tests for 2 children born years apart suggested a complicated family situation. "Will you be testing both children against the same potential father?" she asked. "Yes. My husband. I need to know if Tyler and Zoe are his biological children." She handed me 2 testing kits along with detailed instructions for collecting samples. "The laboratory will need samples from all 3 parties, both children and your husband. Do you anticipate any problems obtaining his cooperation?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. David would have to agree to provide a DNA sample, which meant explaining why I wanted the tests done. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I'll figure it out, I said. From the medical clinic, I drove to my friend Karen's house. She worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and I knew she'd be available for an unscheduled visit. More importantly, she'd been through her own divorce 2 years earlier, and might have practical advice about navigating the legal and emotional complexities I was facing. Karen lived in a renovated farmhouse about 10 minutes from downtown Millbrook, surrounded by gardens that she maintained with the same attention to detail she brought to her design work. She answered the door in paint-stained clothes, holding a coffee mug and looking surprised to see me. "Rachel, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at work?" I'd forgotten that it was a Tuesday morning, and I was supposed to be at my part-time job at the community college's continuing education department. The events of the past 24 hours had completely disrupted my normal routine. "I called in sick," I said. "Can we talk? I need advice." Karen led me to her kitchen, poured me coffee, and listened while I explained everything I'd discovered about David and Chloe's relationship. Unlike Detective Rodriguez, Karen reacted with visible shock and outrage as the story unfolded. "He's been lying to you for 10 years, she said when I finished. 10 years, Rachel. How do you even begin to rebuild trust after something like that?" "I don't know if I want to rebuild it. I'm not sure our marriage was ever what I thought it was." "What do you mean?" I explained my growing realization that David had never fully committed to our relationship. From the beginning, his attention and resources had been divided between me and Chloe. Our marriage had been built on the assumption that I was his primary partner, but the reality was that I'd been sharing that role without knowing it. "So what are you going to do?" Karen asked. "Get the paternity tests done first. I need to know if Tyler and Zoe are David's biological children before I make any decisions about custody or divorce. And if they're not, the question I'd been avoiding. I don't know. Legally, David is their father regardless of genetics. He's on their birth certificates. He's been supporting them their entire lives. But emotionally, I'm not sure how I'd handle knowing that my children were conceived during periods when David was cheating on me." Karen reached across her kitchen table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you find out, Tyler and Zoe are your children. That doesn't change." She was right, of course. But the possibility that they might not be David's biological children raised complicated questions about our family's future. Would David want custody of children who weren't genetically his? Would Chloe try to claim some kind of parental rights if she was the biological mother through David? How would I explain any of this to Tyler and Zoe when they were old enough to understand? I spent the rest of the morning at Karen's house, helping her with a design project while we talked through various scenarios for handling the situation. By the time I left to pick up the children from school, I had a clearer sense of my immediate priorities. First, I needed to collect DNA samples from Tyler and Zoe without alerting them to what was happening. The testing kit instructions suggested collecting samples during normal activities like toothbrushing, so this wouldn't be difficult. Second, I needed to confront David about providing his own DNA sample. This conversation would force us to address the paternity questions directly, which might accelerate the timeline for other decisions about our marriage. Third, I needed to learn more about Chloe's version of events. Her perspective on the relationship with David was clearly different from his, and I suspected there were still important details I didn't understand. Tyler and Zoe seemed normal and cheerful when I picked them up from school, chattering about their day as we drove home. Tyler had gotten an A on his science test, and Zoe had been chosen to be the narrator in her class's upcoming Halloween play. Their innocent excitement about these small accomplishments reminded me how much was at stake in the decisions I was about to make. That evening, I collected DNA samples from both children during their bedtime routine, carefully following the instructions to ensure the samples wouldn't be contaminated. Tyler submitted to having his cheek swabbed with typical 12-year-old indifference, while Zoe was curious about what I was doing. "It's for a health study," I explained, which was technically true. "The doctor wants to check for genetic markers that might affect your future health." "Are we sick?" Zoe asked, concerned. "No, sweetheart, this is preventative, like getting vaccines. It helps doctors know what to watch for as you grow up." She seemed satisfied with this explanation and cooperated cheerfully with the sample collection. David came home around 9 o'clock, claiming he'd been working late to catch up on client portfolios after taking time off for lunch yesterday. I wondered if he'd actually been with Chloe, processing their own conversation about the evening's revelations. "We need to talk," I said after the children were asleep. He nodded, looking resigned. I figured we would. We sat in our living room, the same space where we'd had countless conversations about work stress, vacation planning, and the children's activities. Tonight, it felt like we were strangers occupying a set designed to look like a happy family's home. "I need you to provide a DNA sample for paternity testing," I said without preamble. David's face went pale. "Rachel, does that really matter at this point? I've been Tyler and Zoe's father for their entire lives, regardless of genetics. It matters to me. I need to know if my children were conceived during periods when you were cheating on me with Chloe." "I was never cheating on you. We were separated during those times, remember? You asked for space, you moved into the guest room, you said you needed to figure out whether our marriage was going to work. Being separated doesn't mean you were free to sleep with other people without telling me. We were married, David. We were supposed to be working on our problems, not seeking comfort with other partners." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "You're right. I should have been honest about my relationship with Chloe from the beginning. But I was afraid you'd leave me if you knew the truth." "What truth? That you were still involved with your ex-girlfriend? That I wasn't sure I could give her up. That part of me loved her in a way that felt necessary, like breathing. I'd been taking care of her since she was 12 years old, Rachel. She was like family to me. But she wasn't family. She was your romantic partner who called you daddy and depended on you financially. That's not a family relationship, David. That's a romantic relationship with disturbing psychological dynamics. I know how it sounds. But Chloe wasn't manipulating me, at least not consciously. She genuinely needed me. Her mother died when she was 20, and she had no other support system. I couldn't abandon her. So you decided to maintain two relationships simultaneously without telling either of us the full truth. I thought I could manage both. I thought eventually Chloe would become more independent, and the situation would resolve itself naturally. But it didn't resolve itself. It got more complicated. She became more financially dependent on you, more emotionally demanding. And now she's claiming that she's been part of our children's lives all along. David nodded miserably. She started asking to meet Tyler and Zoe when they were toddlers. She said it was unnatural for me to keep the most important parts of my life separate. When Tyler started playing soccer, she wanted to come to his games. When Zoe had her first recital, she wanted to be there. And you brought her to these events without telling me. She would sit far away, in the back. She never approached you or the children directly. I thought it was a compromise that would satisfy her need to be included without disrupting your sense of family privacy. The betrayal felt even deeper now that I understood how systematically he'd been deceiving me. It wasn't just hidden phone calls and secret dinners. Chloe had been a shadow presence at our children's milestones, watching from a distance while I believed these were private family moments. "What about the business referrals?" I asked. "How much of your success has come through Chloe's connections?" "About 60% of my current client base," he admitted. "Real estate agents and financial advisors work closely together. Chloe introduced me to buyers who needed investment advice, sellers who needed help managing the proceeds from their home sales. It's a natural professional partnership. Natural if you disclose the personal relationship. Unethical if you don't. Do your clients know that the woman referring them to you is your girlfriend? They know we have a personal relationship. I've never hidden that. But they don't know you're married to someone else." David was quiet again, and I realized this was another layer of deception I hadn't fully considered. David's clients believed he was available, unattached, possibly dating Chloe casually. They had no idea he was married with children, which meant they didn't understand the conflict of interest inherent in his business relationship with her. "David, are you in violation of any professional ethics guidelines?" "I don't think so. Financial advisors are allowed to accept referrals from real estate professionals. There's nothing illegal about the arrangement." "But is it ethical? Are you supposed to disclose personal relationships that might affect your professional judgment? He looked uncomfortable, which suggested the answer was yes. We can figure out the professional ethics issues later, I said. Right now, I need you to provide a DNA sample so we can determine whether Tyler and Zoe are your biological children. And if they're not, then we'll deal with that reality. But I can't make decisions about our marriage or our family's future without knowing the truth. David agreed to the paternity testing, though reluctantly. I gave him one of the testing kits, and he provided his DNA sample that night. The next morning, I mailed all 3 samples to the laboratory with instructions for expedited processing. While we waited for results, I decided to arrange a meeting with Chloe. I needed to understand her perspective on the situation and determine whether she posed any threat to my children's well-being. If she genuinely considered herself part of our family, I needed to know what she expected for the future. I called Prestige Properties and scheduled an appointment to discuss selling our house. It wasn't entirely false. Depending on how the paternity results and divorce proceedings went, I might indeed need to sell our home. But it was primarily a pretext for meeting with Chloe in a professional setting where I could control the conversation. We met at her office in Hartford, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that suggested success and sophistication. Chloe was dressed professionally in a navy suit, with her auburn hair pulled back in a neat chignon. She looked younger than her 29 years, but carried herself with confidence that seemed genuine rather than forced. "Mrs. Harper," she said, rising from her desk to shake my hand. "I have to admit, I was surprised to get your call. Are you really thinking about selling your house?" "Possibly. My marriage is going through some changes, and I need to understand my options." She gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk. "I see. Well, I can certainly provide you with a market analysis and discuss the selling process. Your home is in an excellent area, and the market is favorable for sellers right now." For the first several minutes, we maintained the pretense that this was a normal real estate consultation. Chloe pulled up comparable sales in my neighborhood, discussed staging recommendations, and explained the timeline for listing and closing. She was professional and knowledgeable, and I could see why her clients trusted her expertise. But gradually the conversation shifted to more personal territory. "David mentioned that you found out about our relationship," Chloe said as she printed market analysis reports. "How are you handling it? I'm trying to understand what's been happening. David's explanation of your relationship doesn't entirely match what I observed in your text messages." "What do you mean?" "He describes you as emotionally dependent and manipulative. You describe your relationship as a committed partnership that predates his marriage to me. Those are very different narratives." Chloe was quiet for a moment, organizing the papers on her desk. "David has always struggled with taking responsibility for his choices. It's easier for him to portray me as unstable and demanding than to admit that he chose to maintain our relationship because he wanted to." "So you don't consider yourself emotionally dependent on him?" "I consider myself in love with him. Yes, I need him emotionally, but that's what love is. David needs me too, even if he has trouble admitting it." "What about the threats of self-harm when he tried to end your relationship?" Chloe's expression grew defensive. "I was young and scared. When someone you love tries to abandon you for someone else, especially when you've been together for years, it's devastating. I made some poor choices in how I expressed that desperation." "Poor choices like threatening suicide?" "I was genuinely suicidal, Mrs. Harper. I wasn't manipulating David. I was falling apart because the most important person in my life was telling me I was no longer wanted or needed." Her tone was sincere, and I found myself believing that her emotional crises had been genuine rather than calculated. That didn't excuse the behavior, but it suggested a different dynamic than the manipulative predator David had sometimes portrayed. "Tell me about the business relationship," I said. "How much of David's success is due to your referrals?" "Most of it, honestly. When we first started working together, David had maybe 6 clients and was struggling to pay his office rent. I introduced him to buyers who needed financial planning, and word spread through the real estate community that he was knowledgeable and trustworthy." "And what did you get out of these referrals?" "I got to help the person I love succeed in his career. I got to be part of his professional life, even if I couldn't be part of his personal life openly." "Did you receive any compensation for the referrals?" "Not officially. But David has always taken care of my financial needs. My apartment, my car, vacations, shopping. He says it's because he loves me, but I think part of it is recognition for my contribution to his business. This was consistent with what I'd discovered about David's hidden expenditures. The money he'd been spending on Chloe wasn't just romantic gestures. It was compensation for business services that he couldn't acknowledge publicly. What do you want for the future? I asked directly. I want David to stop living a double life. I want our relationship to be acknowledged openly. I want to be part of Tyler and Zoe's lives instead of watching them from a distance. What if the paternity tests show that David isn't their biological father? Chloe's expression grew more complex. Then I suppose we'll all have to figure out what that means. But biology isn't everything, Mrs. Harper. David has been their father in every way that matters. I wouldn't try to change that. But you would want to be involved in their lives? I've been involved in their lives since they were born. I've just been invisible. I'd like to be able to acknowledge my role as someone who cares about them. I left Chloe's office with a better understanding of her perspective, but also with new concerns about what she expected for the future. She clearly saw herself as David's primary partner and wanted recognition for her role in his life and business. She also wanted some kind of relationship with Tyler and Zoe, though she claimed she wouldn't challenge David's parental rights. The question was whether I could accept such an arrangement. Could I share David with another woman openly? Could I allow someone else to have parental influence over my children? Could I trust that Chloe's intentions were genuinely benevolent rather than controlling? These questions became more urgent when I received a call from the laboratory 3 days later. The paternity test results were ready. I drove to their office alone, without telling David or anyone else that the results had come in. I needed to process the information privately before deciding how to share it with others. The laboratory technician was professionally neutral, as she handed me a sealed envelope containing the results. "Would you like me to explain the findings?" she asked. "Please." She opened the envelope and reviewed the documents. For Tyler Harper Chen, the tested man is excluded as the biological father. The probability of paternity is 0%. My heart stopped. Tyler wasn't David's biological child. For Zoe Harper Chen, the tested man is excluded as the biological father. The probability of paternity is 0%. Neither Tyler nor Zoe was David's biological child. I sat in the parking lot outside the laboratory for 20 minutes, staring at the test results and trying to process their implications. Both of my children had been conceived during periods when David was having an affair with Chloe. Both of my children were the biological offspring of David and Chloe, not David and me. But that meant Chloe was their biological mother. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd been raising another woman's children for 12 and 8 years, respectively. Tyler and Zoe were David and Chloe's biological children, born during periods when David was supposedly working on our marriage, but actually maintaining his primary relationship with her. Everything I thought I knew about my family was false. David wasn't just their father, he was their father with another woman. Chloe wasn't just his secret girlfriend, she was the mother of his children. And I was the woman who had unknowingly been raising them while believing they were mine. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just the betrayal of discovering David's lies, but the existential crisis of learning that my children weren't genetically mine. That the family I'd devoted 10 years of my life to building was based on a fundamental deception about its very origins. I drove home in a state of shock, mechanically going through the motions of my normal routine while my mind struggled to accept the new reality. Tyler and Zoe were home from school, doing homework and asking about dinner plans. They looked the same as they had that morning, but everything about their existence in my life had changed. How do you tell children that everything they believe about their family is wrong? How do you explain that their mother is actually their father's other girlfriend, and the woman who raised them is just someone who was deceived about their origins? More immediately, how do you face the woman who is their biological mother and has been watching them grow up from a distance while you believed they were yours? I realized that Chloe's presence at their school events and milestones hadn't been the intrusion of an obsessed girlfriend. It had been a mother watching her own children from the shadows, unable to claim them because of the elaborate deception David had constructed. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. David had orchestrated a scenario where he maintained relationships with both the mother of his children and the woman raising them, all while allowing everyone involved to operate with incomplete information about the true nature of their family structure. I needed legal advice immediately. The paternity test results changed everything about custody, finances, and parental rights. But I also needed emotional support from someone who could help me navigate the psychological impact of learning that my entire identity as a mother was based on lies. That evening, I told David that the paternity test results had arrived, but that I needed time to process them before discussing the findings. He looked terrified, which suggested he suspected what the tests would reveal. "Rachel, whatever the results show, it doesn't change anything about our family. Tyler and Zoe are our children, regardless of genetics." "Our children?" I asked quietly. "Or your and Chloe's children that I've been raising?" His silence was answer enough. I spent that night alone in our bedroom, looking through photo albums and home videos that documented Tyler and Zoe's entire lives. First steps, first words, first days of school, birthday parties, family vacations. In every image and recording, I saw myself as their devoted mother, unaware that I was actually an unknowing surrogate, raising another woman's biological offspring. The cruelest irony was that I loved them completely and unconditionally. The genetic revelation didn't change my emotional attachment to Tyler and Zoe, but it raised devastating questions about my legal rights as their parent and my future role in their lives. Tomorrow, I would have to begin the process of determining whether the family I'd built could survive the truth about its origins, or whether the deceptions had been too fundamental to overcome. The morning after receiving the paternity test results, I woke up with a sense of purpose that surprised me. The devastating emotional impact of learning that Tyler and Zoe weren't my biological children had given way to something colder and more focused. David had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had cost me 10 years of my life and my fundamental understanding of my own identity as a mother. Now it was time for consequences. I called Linda Walsh's office as soon as it opened and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Then I contacted Detective Rodriguez to update him on the paternity results and ask about the legal implications of what David had done. Finally, I made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen, a family therapist who specialized in complex custody situations and psychological manipulation. David had already left for work, claiming an early client meeting. I suspected he was actually meeting with Chloe to discuss strategy now that the paternity tests had been completed. They'd had years to coordinate their stories and prepare for this moment. But I had evidence they didn't know about, and I had legal options they hadn't considered. After dropping Tyler and Zoe at school with their usual breakfast and encouragement about their upcoming tests, I drove to the office of Kevin Morrison, David's former business partner. Kevin had left Sterling Financial Group 2 years earlier, under circumstances that David had described as a personality conflict. Now I wondered if there had been more to their professional separation. Kevin's new office was smaller than Sterling's corporate location, housed in a converted Victorian mansion that had been divided into professional suites. He specialized in ethical financial planning for middle-class families, a niche that put him in direct competition with David's high-end clientele. "Rachel," he said, looking genuinely surprised when his receptionist showed me into his office. "This is unexpected. How are you doing? I'm going through a difficult time with David, and I was hoping you might be able to help me understand some things about his business practices." Kevin's expression grew more serious. "What kind of things?" I explained about discovering David's hidden relationship with Chloe and learning that she was responsible for most of his client referrals. I also mentioned the financial discrepancies I'd found and my concerns about potential ethical violations. "I'm not asking you to violate client confidentiality or professional ethics," I said. "But I need to understand whether David's business practices have been legitimate." Kevin was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his response carefully. "Rachel, I left Sterling because I discovered some irregularities in how David was managing certain accounts. Nothing criminal, but practices that made me uncomfortable from an ethics standpoint." "What kind of practices?" David was accepting referral fees from real estate agents and mortgage brokers without properly disclosing these arrangements to his clients. He was also using client information to benefit his personal investments in ways that created potential conflicts of interest. Referral fees from Chloe? Among others. But Chloe Rivers was by far his largest source of referrals, and the financial arrangements between them were more complex than simple referral fees. David was essentially functioning as her business partner while representing himself to clients as an independent advisor. This was worse than I'd realized. David hadn't just been hiding his personal relationship with Chloe. He'd been violating professional ethics standards in ways that could result in regulatory sanctions or loss of his license. "Why didn't you report these violations?" I asked. "I threatened to. That's why I left the firm." David agreed to buy out my partnership stake in exchange for my silence about what I discovered. "So he paid you not to report his ethics violations?" "Essentially, yes. I told myself I was protecting our mutual clients from the disruption of a regulatory investigation. But honestly, I was also protecting my own financial interests. If Sterling had been sanctioned, my partnership stake would have become worthless." Kevin's admission gave me valuable leverage. If I could demonstrate that David had been violating professional ethics standards for years, it would strengthen my position in divorce proceedings and potentially expose him to regulatory sanctions that would affect his earning capacity. "Would you be willing to provide written documentation of what you discovered?" I asked. "If it comes to that, yes. But Rachel, you should know that exposing these violations will likely result in David losing his license. That would affect not just him, but your family's financial security." "My family's financial security has been built on lies and ethics violations. I'd rather start over with the truth than continue benefiting from deception." I left Kevin's office with a promise that he would compile documentation of David's ethics violations and a better understanding of the scope of the deceptions I was dealing with. David hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been conducting his entire professional life in ways that violated the trust of his clients and regulatory standards. My afternoon meeting with Linda Walsh was even more productive. She reviewed the paternity test results with the focused attention of someone who understood their legal implications. "This changes everything about custody and child support," she said. "Biologically, Chloe Rivers is Tyler and Zoe's mother, and you have no genetic relationship to them. However, you've been their psychological parent for their entire lives, which gives you legal standing to seek custody." "What about David's parental rights?" "He's the biological father and has been acting as their legal father since birth. Unless he voluntarily relinquishes his rights or is found unfit, he'll continue to have parental authority." "And Chloe's rights?" "That's where it gets complicated. She never formally relinquished her parental rights, but she also never established them legally. She's essentially been an absent mother who allowed another woman to raise her children. A court would have to determine whether she has standing to seek custody or visitation." Linda explained that the situation was unprecedented in her experience. Most custody disputes involved divorced parents fighting over their mutual children, or biological parents seeking to reclaim children from adoptive families. But I was a woman who had unknowingly raised another woman's children, while the biological mother maintained a secret relationship with their father. "My recommendation is that we file for divorce immediately and seek primary custody based on your role as their psychological parent," Linda said. "We'll also request child support from David and potentially from Chloe, since they're both biological parents who benefited from your unpaid childcare services." "Can I get child support from a woman who never knew I was raising her children?" "She knew, Rachel. Based on what you've told me, Chloe was aware that David was married and had children. She attended their school events and milestones. She may not have known the children were biologically hers, but she knew they existed and chose not to establish a maternal relationship with them." This was true, and it suggested that Chloe had been complicit in the deception, even if she hadn't orchestrated it. She'd allowed me to raise her biological children while maintaining a secret relationship with their father. "What about the financial fraud aspects?" I asked. "David's hidden expenditures and ethics violations will be relevant in determining asset division. If we can prove that he used marital assets to support his relationship with Chloe or violated professional standards in ways that benefited him financially, we can argue for a larger share of the marital estate." Linda also recommended that I document everything about Tyler and Zoe's daily routines, medical care, educational involvement, and emotional support to establish my role as their primary caregiver. Even though I wasn't their biological mother, I had functioned as their mother in every practical sense. My meeting with Dr. Sarah Chen was emotionally challenging but necessary. She helped me understand the psychological impact of what I'd discovered and develop strategies for protecting Tyler and Zoe during the inevitable disruption to their family structure. The most important thing is maintaining stability for the children while the adults sort out their relationships, Dr. Chen explained. Tyler and Zoe have known you as their mother for their entire lives. That psychological bond is real and important, regardless of genetics. But how do I explain to them that their biological mother is someone they've never met, and that their father has been lying about our family structure for their entire lives? Very carefully, and probably with professional help. Children are more resilient than adults often assume, but they need honest information presented in age-appropriate ways. The key is emphasizing that the adults' mistakes don't change how much they're loved. Dr. Chen also warned me about the potential for Tyler and Zoe to feel loyalty conflicts as the truth about their family emerged. They might feel guilty for loving me if they learned I wasn't their biological mother, or angry at David and Chloe for deceiving them about their origins. Your role will be to reassure them that family isn't just about genetics, she said. You've been their mother in every way that matters. That doesn't change because of DNA test results. That evening, I prepared for the confrontation I'd been planning since receiving the paternity test results. David came home at his usual time, looking nervous and clearly expecting to discuss the test findings. But I had a different conversation in mind. I know about Tyler and Zoe's biological parents, I said as soon as he walked into the kitchen. He froze, still holding his briefcase. Rachel, I can explain. You don't need to explain. I understand perfectly. You and Chloe are their biological parents, and I've been an unknowing surrogate mother for 12 and 8 years respectively. That's not how it happened. When Tyler was conceived, you and I were having problems. Stop. I don't want to hear your justifications or excuses. I want to discuss what happens next. I handed him divorce papers that Linda Walsh had prepared that afternoon. I'm filing for divorce and seeking primary custody of Tyler and Zoe based on my role as their psychological parent. I'm also requesting child support from both you and Chloe. David stared at the legal documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Child support from Chloe? Rachel, she didn't know the children were hers. She knew they existed. She attended their school events. She watched them grow up while I raised them. She was complicit in the deception, even if she didn't initiate it. This will destroy everything. My career, Chloe's business, the children's sense of security. You destroyed everything when you decided to build our family on lies. I'm just revealing the truth. David sat down heavily at our kitchen table. The same table where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations over the past 10 years. What do you want, Rachel? What would it take for us to work through this without involving lawyers and courts? I want the truth. All of it. I want to know exactly when your relationship with Chloe began, why you chose to deceive me about the children's paternity, and what you envisioned for our family's future. The truth is that I love you both. I love you and Chloe in different ways, and I love Tyler and Zoe, regardless of their genetics. I thought I could manage both relationships without anyone getting hurt. But everyone got hurt, David. I've been living a lie for 10 years. Chloe has been relegated to secret status despite being the mother of your children. Tyler and Zoe are about to learn that their entire understanding of their family is false. So what's the alternative? We destroy our family to satisfy your need for honesty? The question revealed how fundamentally David misunderstood the situation. We didn't have a family. We had an elaborate fiction that had been maintained through systematic deception. The destruction had already occurred. I was just acknowledging it. The alternative is that we build something real from the truth, however painful it might be. I explained my plan for handling the situation. I would maintain primary custody of Tyler and Zoe as their psychological parent while David and Chloe established legal recognition of their biological relationship. Financial support would be shared among all three adults based on their respective abilities and contributions. Most importantly, Tyler and Zoe would be told the truth about their origins in age-appropriate ways with professional support. And what about us? David asked. Is there any possibility of saving our marriage? Our marriage was built on the assumption that we were monogamous partners raising our mutual children. Neither of those assumptions was true. I don't see how we can rebuild a relationship from such a fundamentally dishonest foundation. David seemed to finally understand that the situation couldn't be managed or controlled in the ways he was accustomed to. The carefully constructed life he'd built was collapsing, and the only question was whether the collapse would be controlled or chaotic. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Full disclosure about your finances, your relationship with Chloe, and your business practices. Cooperation with the divorce proceedings and custody arrangements. And honesty with Tyler and Zoe about their origins when the time comes to explain the situation to them. And from Chloe? The same. Full disclosure, cooperation with legal proceedings, and acknowledgement of her role as their biological mother with the responsibilities that entails." The next few weeks unfolded with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. David provided financial records that revealed the full scope of his hidden expenditures supporting Chloe's lifestyle. Kevin Morrison supplied documentation of the ethics violations he'd discovered at Sterling Financial Group. Detective Rodriguez opened a preliminary investigation into whether David's business practices constituted fraud. Most importantly, I arranged for family therapy sessions with Dr. Chen to prepare Tyler and Zoe for learning the truth about their family structure. The sessions began with general discussions about different types of families and gradually introduced the concept that sometimes adults make mistakes that affect children in ways that aren't the children's fault. Tyler, with his 12-year-old's developing sense of logic, asked pointed questions about why we were suddenly having family meetings with a therapist. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" he asked during our third session. "Your parents are going through some difficulties that we're working to resolve," Dr. Chen replied. "But whatever happens between the adults, you and Zoe will continue to be loved and cared for. But will we still live together? Will we still be a family?" The question broke my heart because I wasn't sure how to answer it honestly. Would we still be a family once Tyler and Zoe learned that their biological mother was a woman they'd never met? Would they still want to live with me once they understood I had no genetic relationship to them? "Family isn't just about living in the same house," I said carefully. "It's about people who love each other and take care of each other. That part won't change." Zoe, with her 8-year-old's more concrete thinking, was primarily concerned about practical matters. "Will I still get to take piano lessons? Will Tyler still get to play soccer?" "Yes, sweetheart. Your activities and routines will stay the same as much as possible." But even as I reassured them, I knew that major changes were inevitable. The house would probably need to be sold as part of the divorce settlement. David's income might be affected if he faced regulatory sanctions for his ethics violations. Chloe would likely want to establish some kind of relationship with her biological children, which would disrupt the family dynamics Tyler and Zoe had always known. The breakthrough came during our fourth family therapy session when Tyler asked a question that caught both Dr. Chen and me off guard. "Mom, are you and Dad our real parents?" The directness of his question suggested that he'd been thinking about the situation more analytically than I'd realized. Children often sense when adults are withholding important information, and Tyler was old enough to recognize the signs of family crisis. Dr. Chen looked at me questioningly, and I realized this was the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. "What do you mean by real parents, Tyler?" I asked. "I mean, are you the people who made us? Are we related to you by blood?" I took a deep breath and made the decision to trust Tyler and Zoe with honesty. "Your father is your biological father, which means you're related to him by blood. But I'm not your biological mother. I'm the person who has raised you and loved you since you were born, but another woman is your biological mother." The silence in Dr. Chen's office was profound. Tyler stared at me with an expression that cycled through confusion, shock, and something that looked like betrayal. Zoe looked back and forth between Tyler and me, trying to understand why the conversation had suddenly become so serious. "Who is our biological mother?" Tyler asked finally. "Her name is Chloe Rivers. She's a real estate agent who works in Hartford. Your father has maintained a relationship with her throughout our marriage. So Dad has been cheating on you with our real mom?" The bluntness of Tyler's summary was jarring but accurate. "Yes. Your father has been in a relationship with both me and Chloe for years. He never told either of us the complete truth about the situation." "Why didn't she raise us herself?" Zoe asked. That's a complicated question that I don't have a complete answer to. You'll need to ask her and your father about their decisions. Are we going to meet her? Tyler asked. If you want to, yes. But you should know that she's been aware of your existence all along. She's even attended some of your school events and activities, watching from a distance. Tyler's expression darkened. She's been spying on us? Not spying exactly, but yes, she's been observing your lives without introducing herself. Dr. Chen intervened to help process the children's reactions and explain the complex dynamics of their family situation. She emphasized that Tyler and Zoe weren't responsible for the adults' choices and that they would be supported through whatever changes lay ahead. But the damage to their sense of security was obvious. Tyler became withdrawn and angry, asking difficult questions about why the adults in his life had lied to him for so long. Zoe regressed emotionally, becoming clingy and anxious about separation from me. Are you going to stop being our mom? She asked one night as I tucked her into bed. Never. I will always be your mom, no matter what. That doesn't change because of genetics. But if our real mom wants us back, do we have to go live with her? No one is going to make you live anywhere you don't want to live. And you have more than one real mom. I'm your real mom because I've raised you. Chloe is your real mom because she gave birth to you. Both things can be true at the same time. The legal proceedings moved forward with the momentum of an avalanche. David was served with divorce papers and responded with his own filing that attempted to maintain custody of Tyler and Zoe. Chloe was subpoenaed to provide testimony about her relationship with David and her knowledge of the children's existence. The regulatory investigation into David's business practices accelerated when Kevin Morrison filed a formal complaint with the State Financial Services Board. David's clients began receiving notifications that their advisor was under investigation for potential ethics violations, and several withdrew their accounts from Sterling Financial Group. Chloe's response to being named in the custody proceedings was more complex than I'd expected. Rather than fighting for parental rights, she requested mediation to discuss the possibility of shared custody arrangements that would acknowledge everyone's role in Tyler and Zoe's lives. I don't want to disrupt their lives any more than they already have been, she told Linda Walsh during a pre-mediation conference. But I also can't continue pretending that I don't have a relationship to them. The mediation session was scheduled for a Saturday morning at Linda Walsh's office, with all three adults present along with our respective attorneys. Tyler and Zoe were staying with my parents for the weekend, giving us the freedom to discuss their future without them overhearing potentially upsetting details. Walking into that conference room felt like approaching the final act of a tragedy that had been building for months. David sat on one side of the table with his attorney, looking haggard and defeated. Chloe sat across from him with her lawyer, appearing nervous but determined. I took the remaining seat and prepared for the conversation that would determine my family's future. The purpose of this mediation, Linda Walsh began, is to establish custody arrangements and financial responsibilities for Tyler and Zoe Harper Chen that acknowledge the complex family dynamics involved. She outlined the basic facts. David was the biological father and legal father. Chloe was the biological mother but had never established legal parental rights. I was the psychological mother who had raised the children but had no genetic relationship to them. Mrs. Harper is seeking primary custody based on her role as the children's primary caregiver throughout their lives, Linda continued. Mr. Chen is seeking shared custody as their legal father. Ms. Rivers is requesting acknowledgement of her biological relationship and the possibility of establishing a parental role. The next 4 hours were the most emotionally exhausting of my life. We discussed every aspect of Tyler and Zoe's lives, from daily routines to major decisions about education and healthcare. We negotiated financial support arrangements that would ensure their needs were met while acknowledging everyone's economic responsibilities. Most difficult was addressing Chloe's role going forward. She wanted to establish a relationship with Tyler and Zoe, but acknowledged that forcing a maternal relationship on children who barely knew her could be traumatic. I'm not trying to replace Rachel, she said at one point. She's been their mother in every way that matters. But I also can't continue being invisible in their lives. We eventually reached an agreement that felt workable if not ideal. I would maintain primary custody of Tyler and Zoe, with David having visitation rights and Chloe having the opportunity to develop a relationship with them gradually, at their own pace. Financial support would be shared among all three adults based on our respective incomes and assets. Most importantly, Tyler and Zoe would continue receiving therapy to help them process the changes in their family structure and make their own decisions about the relationships they wanted to maintain. As we signed the mediation agreement, I realized that we'd accomplished something unprecedented, creating a family structure that acknowledged the complex realities of our situation while prioritizing the children's well-being above the adults' preferences. It wasn't the family I'd planned to have, but it was built on truth rather than deception. For the first time in months, that felt like progress. 6 months after the mediation agreement was signed, I stood in the kitchen of my new townhouse watching Tyler help Zoe with her science project, while afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that belonged entirely to us. The house was smaller than our old colonial, but it felt more honest somehow, furnished with pieces I'd chosen myself, rather than inherited from a life built on deception. The regulatory board had concluded their investigation into David's business practices the month before, resulting in a 2-year suspension of his financial advisor license and substantial fines that decimated his savings. Sterling Financial Group had closed permanently, leaving David to rebuild his career from scratch while working for another firm in a junior capacity. The professional consequences had been severe, but they paled in comparison to the personal reckoning he was still navigating. Chloe had surprised everyone by handling the transition with remarkable maturity. Rather than demanding immediate integration into Tyler and Zoe's lives, she'd respected their need for gradual adjustment and my role as their primary mother. Our first official meeting had been awkward and painful, but over time we'd developed something resembling a functional co-parenting relationship, built on mutual respect for the children's well-being. "Mom, can you check if this looks right?" Zoe called from the dining table where she was constructing a model of the solar system. "Let me see," I said, examining her careful arrangement of painted styrofoam planets. "Saturn's rings look perfect. Did Tyler help you with those?" "I just held the glue steady," Tyler said, looking up from his algebra homework. She did all the detail work herself. The easy affection between the siblings had remained unchanged despite everything they'd learned about their family's origins. Dr. Chen had warned that children sometimes develop loyalty conflicts when family structures shift dramatically, but Tyler and Zoe had adapted with resilience that continually amazed me. They'd met Chloe for the first time 3 months earlier at a neutral location, a family restaurant where the atmosphere was casual enough to reduce pressure but public enough to feel safe. I'd been prepared for emotional meltdowns or dramatic confrontations, but the reality had been surprisingly mundane. "You look different than I expected," Zoe had told Chloe with her characteristic directness. "Different how?" Chloe had asked. "Smaller. And your hair is darker in person." Tyler had been more reserved, studying Chloe with the analytical intensity he brought to everything that puzzled him. "Did you really not know we were your biological kids?" "I suspected it was possible," Chloe had answered honestly, "but your father and I never discussed it directly. I think we were both afraid of what the truth might mean." "Were you afraid we wouldn't want to meet you?" "Terrified. I've been watching you grow up from a distance for years, feeling proud of your accomplishments but knowing I didn't have the right to claim any credit for them. Rachel raised you to be wonderful people. I was just someone who contributed DNA." The honesty in her response had visibly affected Tyler. Over subsequent meetings, he'd gradually warmed to Chloe while maintaining fierce loyalty to me. The balance was delicate, but it seemed to be working. David's relationship with the children was more complicated. Tyler, in particular, struggled with anger about the years of deception, asking pointed questions about why his father had chosen lies over truth at every critical juncture. "I thought I was protecting everyone," David had explained during one particularly difficult family therapy session. "I thought if I could manage both relationships carefully, no one would get hurt." "But everyone got hurt anyway," Tyler had responded. "Mom got hurt by living a lie. Chloe got hurt by being kept secret. Zoe and I got hurt by finding out our whole family was fake." David had no adequate response to that assessment because it was entirely accurate. His attempts to protect everyone had instead damaged everyone, creating a situation where healing required acknowledging the full scope of his failures. The financial settlement from our divorce had been more generous than I'd expected, partially because David's ethics violations had strengthened my negotiating position, and partially because he genuinely wanted to ensure Tyler and Zoe's stability. The sale of our family home had provided enough equity for me to purchase the townhouse and establish a college fund for both children. Chloe's child support contributions had been modest but consistent, reflecting her genuine commitment to supporting Tyler and Zoe's future, even though she was still establishing her own relationship with them. She'd also transferred several high-value clients to other real estate agents, rather than continue benefiting professionally from connections made through David's unethical practices. My own career had taken an unexpected positive turn when the community college offered me a full-time position developing their continuing education programs. The work was challenging and meaningful, helping adults return to school or develop new professional skills. For the first time in years, I felt valued for my own abilities, rather than my role as someone else's supportive partner. The social adjustments in Millbrook had been more difficult than the practical ones. David's professional downfall had been very public, and by extension, our family's private crisis had become fodder for local gossip. School pickup became an exercise in navigating awkward conversations with other parents who wanted details about our quote 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 prate quote 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 quote. How are you managing such a complex custody arrangement? Margaret Reynolds had asked with poorly disguised curiosity during Tyler's last soccer game. We're taking it one day at a time and focusing on what's best for the children, I'd replied, a response I'd perfected for deflecting intrusive questions. The truth was that managing relationships with both David and Chloe required constant communication and flexibility, but it was working better than I'd initially hoped. We'd established regular family meetings to discuss major decisions about Tyler and Zoe's lives, and both David and Chloe had committed to prioritizing the children's needs over their own comfort or convenience. Tyler's relationship with Chloe had evolved into something resembling friendship with a biological mother he was gradually getting to know. They shared an interest in architecture and design that created natural conversation topics, and Chloe had begun teaching him about real estate investment as a potential career path. Zoe's connection with Chloe was more immediately affectionate but also more superficial. At 8 years old, she was fascinated by having a bonus mom who took her shopping and taught her about makeup and fashion. The relationship felt safe to Zoe because it didn't threaten her primary attachment to me. Chloe says I have her eyes but your smile, Zoe had announced after their most recent visit. Is that possible if we're not related? Absolutely. Families are made up of all kinds of relationships. You can look like Chloe and smile like me because you've learned expressions from watching me. These conversations had become routine as Tyler and Zoe processed their complex family structure. Dr. Chen had praised their emotional intelligence and adaptability, noting that children who grow up understanding that families can take many forms often develop stronger interpersonal skills. The most surprising development had been David's gradual transformation from someone who managed multiple deceptions to someone committed to radical honesty. The professional and personal consequences of his lies had been so devastating that he'd seemingly decided truth was preferable to continued deception, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. I want Tyler and Zoe to understand that what I did was wrong, he'd told me during one of our co-parenting conversations. Not just the lying, but the arrogance of thinking I could control everyone's reality to avoid making difficult choices. His relationship with Chloe had also evolved, becoming less romantic and more focused on their shared responsibility as Tyler and Zoe's biological parents. They still cared for each other, but the dramatic intensity of their earlier dynamic had been replaced by something more mature and sustainable. We're learning to be partners in parenting rather than lovers hiding from consequences, Chloe had explained when I'd asked about their current relationship status. The question of whether David and Chloe would eventually marry had been addressed directly during one of our family meetings. Tyler, in particular, wanted to know if his biological parents planned to create a traditional nuclear family that might compete with his attachment to me. Chloe and I have decided not to pursue a romantic relationship for the foreseeable future, David had said. We need to focus on rebuilding trust with all of you and learning to co-parent effectively. Romance would complicate those priorities. I'd been surprised by how relieved I felt hearing this decision. Despite my commitment to putting Tyler and Zoe's needs first, I wasn't sure I could handle the additional complexity of David and Chloe presenting as a unified couple while I remained the single co-parent. As spring turned to summer, our unconventional family structure began feeling more natural and less like an arrangement we were all trying to manage. Tyler and Zoe spent weekends with David, occasional afternoons with Chloe, and the majority of their time with me. The adults maintained regular communication about everything from homework struggles to medical appointments. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Tyler and Zoe knew exactly who they were biologically related to and who had raised them. They understood that their family looked different from most of their friends' families, but they also understood that different didn't mean damaged. "Are you happy with how everything turned out?" Tyler asked me one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't considered whether happiness was the appropriate measure of our situation's success. "I'm happy that we're living truthfully now," I said. "I'm happy that you and Zoe know who you are and where you come from. I'm happy that we've all learned to choose honesty over comfortable lies. But are you happy that Dad cheated and lied for years? Are you happy that you raised kids who aren't biologically yours?" The bluntness of his questions reminded me that Tyler was approaching adolescence and would soon be grappling with identity issues that were complicated by his unusual family origins. "I'm not happy about the deception," I said carefully, "but I can't regret raising you and Zoe. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, regardless of genetics. And sometimes difficult experiences teach us important lessons about what really matters." "What did you learn?" "I learned that family is about choice and commitment, not just biology. I learned that truth is always better than comfortable lies, even when it's painful, and I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "I learned that adults make mistakes too, and that sometimes the mistakes turn out okay in the end." His perspective reminded me that resilience isn't just about surviving difficult circumstances, it's about finding meaning and growth within them. Tyler and Zoe were developing emotional intelligence and adaptability that would serve them well throughout their lives. As summer progressed, I found myself looking forward rather than backward for the first time in years. The townhouse was becoming a home that reflected my authentic preferences rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's needs. My career was developing in directions that excited me. Most importantly, my relationship with Tyler and Zoe was stronger than ever, built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the protective deceptions that had characterized David's parenting style. The anniversary of discovering David's affair passed without fanfare, but I marked it privately as the beginning of my journey toward authentic living. The woman who had found lipstick stains and text messages a year earlier had been devastated by betrayal, but still committed to preserving a comfortable illusion. The woman I'd become was committed to truth, regardless of its complexity. On a warm Saturday evening in late July, our extended family gathered for Tyler's 13th birthday party in the backyard of my townhouse. David brought the grill and handled cooking duties. Chloe brought decorations and helped coordinate party games. I provided the cake and managed the overall logistics. Watching Tyler open presents surrounded by friends from school, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the family we'd created from the wreckage of our deceptions. It wasn't the family I'd planned to have, but it was honest and functional, and filled with people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. "Thank you," Chloe said quietly as we cleaned up paper plates and wrapping paper after the guests had gone home. "For what?" "For raising them so well. For protecting them during the worst of our mistakes. For making it possible for me to have a relationship with them now. Thank you for respecting my role as their mother and not trying to compete with that." We worked together in comfortable silence. Two women who had found a way to share the responsibility and joy of raising children who belonged to both of us in different ways. As Tyler and Zoe got ready for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed and how much we'd all grown in the process. The comfortable lies that had once defined our family had been replaced by uncomfortable truths that ultimately proved more sustainable. "Mom," Zoe called from her room, "will you tell me the story about when I was born?" It was a request she made periodically, wanting to hear about her early days from the perspective of the woman who had raised her, rather than the woman who had given birth to her. I sat on the edge of her bed and began the familiar tale. You were the most beautiful baby anyone had ever seen, with tiny perfect fingers and the softest hair. Dad and I were so excited to bring you home and introduce you to Tyler, who had been asking for a little sister for months. As I told the story, I realized that every word was true, even though the biological facts were more complicated than I'd originally understood. I had been there for Zoe's first breath, first smile, first steps, first words. I had been the one to comfort her through illnesses and celebrate her achievements. Biology had contributed to her existence, but I had contributed to her becoming. When Zoe fell asleep, I checked on Tyler, who was reading by lamplight in his room. Good birthday? I asked. The best. Having everyone there together felt right, somehow, even though it's weird. Weird how? Weird that my biological parents aren't married to each other, and my mom isn't my biological mom, but somehow it all works. It shouldn't work, but it does. Tyler's observation captured something essential about our family's evolution. We'd created something that defied conventional categories, but succeeded in meeting everyone's needs for connection, stability, and honest relationship. Sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other, rather than the ones that happen by accident, I said. Is that what we did? Chose each other? That's exactly what we did. And we keep choosing each other, every day. After Tyler turned off his light, I stood in the hallway of my townhouse listening to the quiet sounds of my children sleeping safely in their beds. The house felt peaceful in a way our old colonial never had, despite its larger size and more expensive furnishings. I thought about the woman I'd been a year earlier. Devoted wife, committed mother, content with a life that seemed stable and predictable. That woman had been living in a carefully constructed illusion, protected from painful truths by her own willingness to avoid difficult questions. The woman I'd become was harder but also more resilient, committed to authenticity over comfort, truth over convenience. I'd lost the marriage I thought I'd wanted, but gained a sense of self that was entirely my own. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Thank you for making Tyler's party so special. He seemed genuinely happy today. I typed back. He was happy. We all were. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was completely true. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.